All right, as promised, talking about the second trimester exam for Monday. Big ideas and themes as they occur in the literature. This is geared obviously toward the written section on the test, where you will have to synthesize some major concepts, relate some ideas across different works, and otherwise just talk about what's going on in some of the pieces of literature that we've been reading this trimester. So this will really be in three parts. First part, Transcendentalism. When we began in January, we began in the early to mid 1800s with writers who identified themselves as Transcendentalists. So first we needed to define Transcendentalism, which was a four-part definition. We said that Transcendentalism is a philosophical, literary, and artistic movement that believed in four things. First, they believed in the primacy of nature, the importance of nature, nature as the fundamental teacher and the center of all creation and life. Therefore, they saw through nature the interconnectedness of all things. This is what Emerson called the oversoul, the idea that we are connected not just to the rest of mankind, but to really all of creation, plant life, animal life, etc. Third, the role of the individual, the idea that each individual has great power to exert in this world, and that an individual can come to reshape not only his own private life, but potentially the universe. And then the struggle of man versus machine. This was a movement that really is in reaction to technological breakthrough and sees a lot of tension and issue with the increasingly technological components of man's life, and it's about taking a step back. So it tries to value humanity over efficiency, it tries to value humanity over economy. Secondly, we'd want to know that Transcendentalism was led primarily by two men who lived in Concord, Massachusetts, Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau. Emerson is properly the father of Transcendentalism. He's the older of the two. He was the mentor to Thoreau, but really it is Emerson and Thoreau's writings that paved the way for the rest of Transcendentalism, though you can consider, and rightly would consider, certain writers like Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, Bronson Alcott, among others, as Transcendentalists. Emerson and Thoreau are really at the center of the movement. And then finally, we see this as a movement that is back to nature. The Transcendentalists inspired many social movements, but amongst them the conservationist movement, the idea of setting aside land for national parks, the idea of protecting the environment, limiting pollution, etc., all can be traced to them. And that's because they were reacting to the rapidly industrializing life that was being lived in the mid-19th century, with the dawn of railroads and steam engines and coal-powered furnaces and factories and assembly lines and things. They saw this as speeding up man's life and really costing us important parts of our humanity. So as the Transcendentalists wished and wanted, there were some social programs that became implemented later to kind of take a step back and limit, I guess you could say, the effects of industrialization as it affects the natural world around us. So those would be some things to think about with Transcendentalism. These, of course, need to be then related to the works of the Transcendentalists. So where do you see this in nature, self-reliance, Walden, civil disobedience, etc.? I think that can be seen pretty readily. So you should look at how to connect these ideas to your readings. Secondly, we have the American Civil War. Following the Transcendentalists, the very next generation of American life, people lived through the Civil War, 1861 to 1865. Looking at the war, we need to understand the social and economic pressures that led to this conflict. Obviously, the issue at hand is usually just described as slavery, but it's a very complex picture. Why is it that the North was able to get away from this institution while the South stayed tied to it? Well, the North industrialized more rapidly. In the North, the economy went from an agrarian economy, which didn't suit the North as well as it did the South, to a manufacturing and industrialized economy in a factory system where slave labor wasn't as necessary. Machine labor was doing the job. Whereas the South, whose land and climate and crop cycle favored an agrarian economy, slave labor was thought to be a necessary thing to keep that agricultural economy going. So northern states had already abolished slavery, southern states had not, and this led to this inevitable conflict. As new states were joining the Union, would they join as free or slave? And ultimately, these social and economic pressures come to a head in the Civil War. Now, as these economic and social pressures are coming to a head, you have to realize that there is a whole spectrum of attitude toward the conflict. And this is one of the more interesting things we saw in the literature. You have men like Walt Whitman and Abraham Lincoln who are incredibly enthusiastic about the necessity for the Civil War. Lincoln saw the Civil War as a necessary cause to fight, as something that would unite the nation and rid it of an evil institution. Whitman echoed this in his poetry. Their thinking is very much in keeping with one another. So Whitman and Lincoln would be idealistic supporters of war. And then you had men like Bierce, Ambrose Bierce, and Robert E. Lee. Interestingly enough, Bierce and Lee both were involved militarily, both fought in the war, whereas Whitman and Lincoln were, Lincoln obviously involved as a statesman, as a leader politically. Whitman on the periphery involved in it, but the men with actual battle experience had a much more nuanced attitude toward the conflict. Ambrose Bierce fought for the Union during the Civil War. In his short story, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, he expresses kind of an ambivalence, a feeling two ways about things. On the one hand, this war sort of wasn't an inevitability, but on the other hand, Bierce does not show clear-cut good guys and bad guys, winners and losers. Bierce sort of complicates and troubles his story with deceit and deception and who is right and who is wrong, and is this hanging justified? Is this poor guy being killed, really deserving of it, or was he just set up? And Bierce shows that there's no simple conflict. There's no simple loss of life from war. It's all tragic and it's all very complicated. Robert E. Lee echoes this in his letter to his son, where he really questions the necessity of the conflict. Remember that Lee's father was General Washington's right-hand man, a great Revolutionary War hero, and Lee was deeply saddened at the idea of severing the Union. He knew that men like his father had fought very, very hard to make this country, and the idea of destroying it broke his heart. And so Lee does not want to fight. But again, Lee sees the fighting as sort of an inevitability and is pulled in on the side of the South. So you have those who viewed this conflict as an idealistic necessity, and you had those who dealt with this conflict as an unfortunate inevitability. Those are two very different attitudes toward the conflict. Then finally, we have The Great Gatsby, our major work for the trimester, a piece of modernism, coming much later than these two periods. 1925, the book was published. But we have, I'm going to outline four very important themes to deal with. First, we have this idea of the American dream. And many, many people think that Fitzgerald wrote the definitive novel about the American dream here with The Great Gatsby. The American dream, as sort of popularly understood, is the idea of starting with nothing and through your own efforts and your own abilities and through much hard work, arriving at a place of power and influence and prominence and success in this country. Whether that is an immigrant experience, new to this country, or a native-born American who happens to rise in his station, either is an acceptable incarnation of the American dream. At the very end of The Great Gatsby, in Chapter 9, Henry Gatz, Jay Gatsby's father, James Gatz's father, produces this book that Gatsby had as a boy, and he has a schedule and a list of resolves written out in it, very similar to Ben Franklin's autobiography, which we read in the first trimester. And I think Fitzgerald's giving a nod to Franklin as the quintessential self-made American. He's showing that Gatsby is that embodiment in the American dream. And so we have to ask ourselves, is Gatsby an American dream success story or an American dream failure? And he is, of course, both. On the surface, he has achieved everything the American dream is about. He has gained money, renown, all the trappings of success, all the toys. He has all of the things that one would equate with success. But of course, ultimately, he's a failure. He loses the woman of his dreams. He is murdered in a fit of rage. And not only that, but after his death, nobody wants anything to do with him. So Gatsby shows the success and the failure of the American dream. And I think for many people, this is Fitzgerald's way of pointing out our obsession with superficialities and with money. And that this is a hard lesson to learn. Now, secondly, speaking about Gatsby and whether or not he's a success or a failure, this really is a question about the ideal self versus the real self. And this is seen in Gatsby as well as in our narrator, Nick Carraway. The clearest idea, or the clearest, I guess, incarnation of this idea in the book is when Nick is relating the real personality behind Jay Gatsby, when he's talking about the James Gatz creation of Jay Gatsby. He says that Jay Gatsby of West Egg, Long Island, sprang from his platonic conception of himself. And we're talking about a platonic ideal, the existence of something not in reality but in the mind. And Jay Gatsby is a figment of the imagination. He is a created character. He's a fake name, a fake personality, a fake job, a fake fortune. He is in many ways the perfect ideal self. And then we can remember a couple of other parts of the book that kind of hint at this. When Nick first meets Gatsby, he talks about Gatsby's smile. And he says that Gatsby smiled an understanding smile that saw you as you wished to be, that understood you as far as you wanted to be understood, and had the impression of you that you hoped to convey. So that Gatsby isn't just an ideal in and of himself, but that he sees the ideal in other people. And we realize that he sees the ideal in Daisy. The woman that he loves is far greater than the actual character of Daisy Buchanan. Daisy Buchanan is a very vain, self-centered, selfish person, and Gatsby loves her as though she is the most fantastic woman that has ever lived. So you see that Gatsby is not just is he an ideal in and of himself, but he sees that ideal in others. And then Gatsby's ultimate destruction by Tom Buchanan in Chapter 7 of the Plaza Hotel is really this conflict between the ideal and the real. When Tom confronts Gatsby with the truth about who he is and about his own past and about Daisy and about his relationship with Daisy, it destroys Gatsby. He cannot understand or fathom these things. He cannot deal with their existence. And ultimately, Gatsby is undone right here or there. Tom is a far less likable character, a far less interesting character, but he triumphs over Gatsby in the end because the real will always crush the fantastic, the made up. Now, it's not just Gatsby that is struggling with this ideal self versus real self. We see this a great deal with our narrator, Nick Carraway, as well. When the book starts, Nick tells us that he is a straightforward and honest guy. He reserves judgment of people. At the end of chapter 4, he has this famous line where he says, "Everyone suspects himself one of the cardinal virtues, and this is mine. I'm one of the few honest people I know." He then proceeds to get involved with Jordan Baker, who is incurably dishonest, and they have this very symbolic conversation about driving a car, and Jordan basically says that she's with Nick because he's a nice, simple guy, and he'll never do anything to hurt her. Now, Nick, as he progresses in this book, strays from his own moral compass. He gets involved in two different people's extramarital affairs. He is an accomplice to their adultery. He himself is dating a very dishonest woman, and he puts himself constantly around people who are doing things that make him uncomfortable. And Nick finally realizes that he can no longer claim to be as honest and as innocent as he once was. So from that line in chapter 4, where he proclaims himself to be an honest person, we have Nick in chapter 9 say to Jordan when they're breaking up, "I'm 30 years old, I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it honor." This shows his growth. This shows how Nick has put aside maybe his idealized conceptions of the type of person he is or he thinks he should be, and how he's kind of grown to accept the real Nick. And that comes with some pain. The idea that Nick realizes his flaws, his dishonesty, it's part of his disillusionment. It's part of why he leaves New York. It's part of why he has nothing but scorn for Tom and Daisy and Jordan. And it's also a reason why he still likes Gatsby in the end. He still likes Gatsby because Gatsby held on to that ideal, even though it kills him, even though it brings him nothing but pain. Um, Nick admires Gatsby's romanticism and his optimism, and he finds something beautiful in it, even as it is destroying him. Now, talking obviously about Gatsby and Nick side by side like that, it calls to mind, how we can look at these two men as the central figures of the book, which obviously they are, and what maybe Fitzgerald is saying to us through that. Fitzgerald does a couple of very clever things to put Nick and Gatsby side by side throughout the book. He has them be next door neighbors, which is one obvious thing, but there's some subtle throwaways, or seemingly throwaways, they're certainly not throwaways, seemingly subtle throwaway lines that really add up to much more. At the very beginning of the book, chapter 1, Nick tells us he's descended from these dukes in Scotland, and then when Gatsby is talking about his Oxford days, he shows Nick a picture where he's standing next to the Earl of Doncaster. And in English peerage, in the landed gentry of England, these two men are the same. Gatsby is standing at Oxford with someone who would, I guess, have to be identified as Nick's distant cousin. So not only are Gatsby and Nick in that car together, looking at that photograph, but there was Gatsby at Oxford with this relative of Nick's. These two men's lives seem intertwined in very important ways. And Nick sees in Gatsby certain things that he admires. He sees in Gatsby certain things that he hates. And this conflict, I think, is an external way of seeing Nick's conflict within himself. Nick is struggling with his own dishonesty and his own integrity, and he sees that struggle in Gatsby. One of the things I like most about Nick in this book is that he is able to give a fairly honest assessment of Gatsby. He's able to point out that Gatsby is dishonest. He's able to point out that Gatsby is a criminal, that Gatsby is deluded, but he's also able to say that he loves him and that he thinks that Gatsby is the only person from his time in New York that is worthwhile at all. So the two main characters that we have in this book, Nick and Gatsby, a very complex relationship, and considering that Gatsby dies, and there's still a whole other chapter of the book to wrap things up, shows you that it's not just about Gatsby, that there's a significant portion of the story that does concern Nick and what he is doing, and that leads us to our last of these, which is the journey from innocence to experience. And it really is Nick's journey from innocence to experience. In chapter 1, Nick tells us about moving to New York, how excited he is, how enthusiastic he is. He talks about all the things he wants to learn, all the things he wants to do, walking around his new neighborhood on Long Island, walking around the streets of Manhattan. He talks about these romantic daydreams he has about women he meets. He talks about the excitement of seeing the crowds going to the theater, and he realizes that New York is a very fast-paced and sophisticated and cool place to be. And then Nick goes to parties with rich people and meets celebrities, and it's all very exciting. But somehow these things become tainted for him because of the experiences he has around Tom and Daisy and Jordan and Gatsby. And ultimately, this promise and this hope are sort of ruined because he sees a man with a beautiful dream destroyed by careless and reckless people. So Nick goes from innocence to experience, and that journey is always going to be fraught with some peril, and it's always going to cause some pain. And we see that Nick is a more bitter, more disillusioned guy at the end than he was in the beginning. And that really is, I think, again, Fitzgerald offering us a social critique on the age in which he lived, the decadence of the 1920s, the superficialities of it, but also showing some of the hope by ending with such a wonderful and such a beautiful piece of writing as the end, where we still look at America as this bright, expectant land where wonderful things can happen. So Fitzgerald strikes a very delicate, but I think a very beautiful balance between kind of a cynical look at American life in the 20th century, but also a very hopeful and inspiring take on what might be America's future. So those would be some ideas to think about for the trimester exam. I hope this was helpful, and good luck to you.